Okay, looks like we are live. We'll wait a couple of minutes before our regulars join in for the weekly.
We have the audience carry. Let's start.
Okay, all right, let's start. Namaste and welcome to the Bharatvaarta Weekly. Thank you so much for joining us on this very beautiful Sunday morning. Hi Ashish, hi Vatsa, how are you guys doing?
Hello,
Good
doing
carry.
well.
Hi.
So we have tons of content, to discuss in this weekly, and I guess we can get started with a brief overview of what we put out last week. We put out a couple of very interesting, eclectic sort of episodes. One covering the life of Sri Manohar Parikar. Ashish, what was the experience like talking to Mr. Nitin Gokhale?
Yeah, so Nitin has written a book on the life and the work of Mr. Manohar Parikar, who was India's probably the most impactful defense minister we ever had, but who had a very short term, just about 2.5 years. The book was released in December on his birth anniversary, but it was launched then, but it came out on the market only in March, coinciding with his second death anniversary. So the book is very much available on all the online platforms. It is actually a collection of Nitin's personal experiences. So he worked with Mr. Parikar very closely while he was in Delhi, and it is quite personal in the sense that he has interviewed a lot of his family members, old associates, office colleagues, and so on, and gives a very important glimpse in the various decisions. And just to kind of recap quickly, one rank, one pension, the Tejas adoption by IF, the Rafael deal which we signed up, the appointment of chief of defense staff, the indigenization of manufacturing in India. Practically humongous decisions were taken during Mr. Parikar's tenure, and he covers each of them in a separate chapter. Not to forget the Uri surgical strike as well, right? So a lot of that is covered as a story, along with Nitin's own very personal touch to the story. So interesting book and interesting conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the regard that Mr. Gokhale has for Manohar Parikarji is very heartfelt, and that comes across in the discussion more so, right? Vatsa, what do you think about the railway wala episode? I mean, very eclectic content, right?
Yeah, I mean, very different kind of episode compared to what we do normally. And I mean, the thing is, it's what 168 years now since the first train ran in India. So there's definitely a lot of history associated with Indian Railways, and they've done a pretty good job, I would say, considering the constraints that they face with subsidizing passenger traffic and so on, with maintaining the heritage part of railways with the museums, some of the toy trains and so on, all of which are not probably profitable. I mean, it's if you look at more developed countries, the heritage part actually probably generates revenue, which helps running the railways. In India, it's a little different, and I think she spoke about that as well, and all the things they're trying to do to change it and bring the history of railways closer to the common man. So I kind of liked the episode. It was short but quite insightful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think while the focus remains on making trains and transport cheaper, more accessible, of course, right, and faster, of course, but the social and cultural significance as well is immense, especially with the Indian Railways. All right, let's move on to the first piece of news. Um, Citibank is exiting the Indian consumer banking market. The global CEO, Jane Fraser, announced the move at the bank's first quarter earnings call. The bank will cease consumer banking in 13 countries, including India. Citibank serves 2.9 million retail customers in India with over 2.2 million credit card accounts. The business will reportedly continue as usual until the bank finds a buyer. The bank will first seek regulatory approvals from the RBI to start the exit process through the sale of business. Citibank has been operating in India since 1902 when it first opened its branch in Kolkata. Srivatsa, this isn't the first bank to close operations in India, right? Your thoughts?
So it's an interesting one, right, Carrie? Because I think Citibank has a favorable structure when it comes to India. They run a branch, so access to capital and all that is much easier for them. They can directly borrow from the parent. Whereas if a new bank were to set up, they would have to sort of finance locally, comply more to local regulations, and so on. So it's kind of interesting that they're looking to exit India despite having some of these advantages. In the global context, City India is not that big. I mean, it's just a little over 1.5% of the global book. So, I don't think the CEO would even be looking at the business once a quarter. Honestly speaking, it's not significant in the global sense. Uh, I think, see, whenever there are these major financial sort of events, these kind of things happen. So we saw that even in 2008, when the crisis hit, quite a few banks left India. So Deutsche Bank left India. Its credit card business ended up with IndusInd. ABN AMRO left India. It ended up selling its India business to RBS, which in turn sold it off, I think, in 2015. So some of this is definitely sort of consolidation, where the bank is looking to focus on what its core businesses are, right? And I think another aspect when it comes to retail is it's a lot more competitive in India, and foreign banks face a lot of constraints. So foreign banks in India, for instance, are not allowed to open more than 12 branches in a year. Although RBI usually sort of is a little more relaxed when it comes to the number. It allows banks to open a few more, which is probably what an ICICI opens in Pune in a year, right? Maybe more actually. Uh, so Citi's business in India is pretty interesting in the sense that they were one of the pioneers when it came to credit cards. So I think there'll be a lot of interest in that business. And also DBS, which acquired Lakshmi Vilas Bank, something we covered in one of the weeklies and one of the podcasts as well. DBS might actually be interested in the retail business because it gives them kind of a foothold in some cities where they're not present. Some of the bigger cities with probably more affluent customers. So if I look at it, yeah, it's kind of natural. There is more and more consolidation happening in the Indian banking industry as well. Public sector banks are being merged. We are moving to fewer bigger banks, which are kind of more geographically well spread, with a few regional banks. That seems to be the general direction in which we are headed, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Although I think at some point in the future, City might actually, regret this and look to come back. And I don't think that's very far in the future. That's how I see it. I do think they will look to come back in India because we've done a long India series where we are talking about the 20s being India's decade. That automatically means that we'll have more affluent customers and so on. So at that point, I think at some point, I think in the near future, we will look for City to try to come back into the Indian market.
Quite a few.
Just to add, both Vatsa and I are City alums actually in some ways.
I was just gonna.
Oh yes.
Indirectly, let's say.
Yes, actually.
We worked on the technology which some of the customers in the chat are probably worried about were done by both Vatsa and me at some point of time.
Even Nimish, who's going to be on the next podcast, he's a City alum.
Yeah, I was just gonna mention that. I mean, we see a few customers in the chat, right? All right, moving on. The US has blocked the export of raw materials for the vaccine, but the TRIPS waiver might actually encourage the vaccine flow. 10 US senators have urged US President Joe Biden to support India's proposal to temporarily lift intellectual property barriers and allow countries to locally manufacture COVID-19 diagnostics and vaccines. This waiver is vital to ensuring a sufficient volume of equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. The TRIPS waiver is also essential to ensure all global economies can recover from the pandemic. Serum Institute of India Chief Executive Mr. Adar Poonawalla on Friday urged US President Joe Biden to lift the export ban on critical raw materials required for the production of vaccines. Ashish, there's plenty of debate, plenty of discussion happening on this whole vaccine situation. I guess we will cover this in a future episode. But can you just make sense of what's happening right now?
Yeah, so multiple issues here, right? So the first one is that this debate, which is currently we are looking at from the raw material perspective, is more relevant to Covaxin and not for Covishield at all. Covaxin uses like one component called adjuvant, which they source from a Kansas-based firm, Virovax. This deal was signed in October, and had the US indicated at that time that there could be a export restriction coming in through like the Wartime Act, which they have now used. Probably Bharat Biotech would have sourced it alternatively. Now the challenge is because they are used that component, they are stuck with that that formulation, and they are unable to expand with the Biden administration not relaxing the export controls. So this is an immediate issue for Bharat Biotech. When we say that, I mean, just yesterday there has been an announcement. Actually, a day before in the night, there was an announcement of the Bharat Biotech capacity being expanded both in Bangalore in its own plant, and then 3 other public sector units to make the vaccine. That process may be relatively slower until some of these issues are resolved. At least the supply issue is resolved, if not specifically for Bharat Biotech, if not a global waiver which US puts in. So that is one part. The second part is on the tweet which Mr. Poonawalla put out, requesting the US president to not hold on to exports. The challenge there is not for Covishield, but for Covavax, which is the Indian name for Novavax, which Mr. Poonawalla is producing. So that is a very different problem. We don't have that vaccine approved at all right now. In fact, the trial itself has not happened because the production has not started in India. So I don't know, what is the timeline for that now? Looks like potentially post, I mean, maybe Q4 this year at the earliest in the current circumstances. But just to clarify, there is no issue for Covishield at all with the US policy. So I think that is important to note, because there's been a lot of confusion around that in the media and in the reporting. The third part is that India, along with South Africa, has made a representation in the WTO to suspend temporarily the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, or the TRIPS arrangement, right? So we have asked for a TRIPS waiver for all the vaccine-related, all the vaccines basically. So the idea is that we can reverse engineer, more companies can produce some of these vaccines based on their understanding of the formulation and so on. This, of course, the US is not agreeing for. Remember that, there's a very unique situation, Carrie, that only 4 countries in the world have been able to do the vaccine. So China with its Sinovac, US, of course, had Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, Novavax. US plus Germany were involved in the Pfizer vaccine. So I should say Germany being the third country, BioNTech being the firm involved with Pfizer. And of course, India did a vaccine with Bharat Biotech, right? So as such, the IP situation is not, it's a very specific situation directed at the US. China, of course, Sinovac, even if China allows, the efficacy of the vaccine has been in question. So that's kind of not very relevant. So that only leaves US because Pfizer has the rights for, and of course for UK as well with AstraZeneca. How can I forget that? So it's mainly targeted at those 2 vaccines. So even if US allows this, it will take a few months for the companies to scale up. But this will be useful for, let's say, the future spurts of COVID. If more companies are producing the vaccines. So that is the ask. The good thing is that even within US, Senator Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, a lot of them have written a letter to President Biden to allow this to happen, which is a good development. Not sure if the big pharma will relent. But I think interesting times, because if this happens, it will certainly benefit the Indian manufacturers, pharma manufacturers.
Right. So we have more than a couple of questions in chat about the second wave and vaccines. Right. Guys, we will cover this in further detail on a follow-up episode for sure. I think there's plenty of nuances to uncover. Right. For now, let's move on to the next piece of news. Nirav Modi's extradition to India has been cleared by the UK government. UK Home Secretary Mrs. Preeti Patel signed the order on Thursday. However, Modi still has the option of legally challenging this decision within 28 days. The jeweler is wanted by Indian courts for fraud and money laundering to the tune of 14,000 crores in the Punjab National Bank loan scam. He is now facing two sets of criminal proceedings, a CBI case against him relating to illegal letters of undertaking and the Enforcement Directorate case relating to the laundering of proceeds of this fraud. Earlier, Nirav Modi argued in the London court that he had a family history of depression and suicide and his mental condition had turned severe in the pandemic. Srivatsa, is this finally a win for India in terms of the extradition, or will we see this getting further delayed? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, before I get to that, Ashish mentioned he and I are City alums. I think I'm definitely glad that I'm not a PNB alum, considering the technology that they have. So let me just actually give sort of a background on what actually happened. The thing was, so obviously when he scammed PNB, there were employees involved, right? And there are two separate kind of systems that run in PNB. One is for payments and one is what is called as core banking, which is like the accounting system. And for some reason, these were not linked in PNB, in the sense that the payments were done separately and then they were reconciled with the accounting system. And SWIFT, which is the mechanism through which payments happen, is a separate system in itself, which is why he could kind of run this scam for such a long time. Mostly because they had such poor systems and they couldn't sort of upgrade it, and they didn't have operational controls in place to track all of this, right? What they used to do is to get, as you mentioned, something called letters of undertaking, which is basically like a bank guarantee, using which he would borrow money from subsidiaries of Indian banks abroad. So if you look at the entire diamond business, there are different countries involved, right? If you look at the entire supply chain, there are countries like Botswana and South Africa where diamonds are mined, and then they come to India, where they're kind of polished or created jewelry and so on, and they're sent to Antwerp, where again there is a big sort of jewelry business that operates. So that's pretty much the entire supply chain. And in that, this is actually a very profitable business for banks, because they can lend money to people who are borrowing who are buying the diamonds and then also selling them on. So they can pretty much rotate the same cash over short cycles and make money. So that's why it's a good business for banks to be in. But what Nirav Modi did was he used the fact that this was so geographically spread across countries to his advantage, and the fact that banks had such disparate systems. So basically, the payments were underreported in the core banking system, and the actual payment amount would be something else. So they did all of these things. And he ended up being caught when one particular bank employee insisted for 100% margin for giving him a letter of undertaking, one of his folks a letter of undertaking. And they said, no, but we've been getting this for years and we're not giving margin and so on. So just, I think the fact that they went one step too many, trying to scam the bank for too long, is the reason they ended up getting caught. Nirav Modi is in UK on an investor visa, and he's, I think, tried every possible trick in the book to not get extradited, right? Some of which you mentioned. He even agreed to a £4 million bail bond with severe restrictions on movement. Even that was denied to him. He's still in a jail. There were many expert witnesses that he got from India, like Abhay Tipse, who's a High Court judge himself, who actually testified on his behalf, saying that if Nirav Modi comes to India, he will not be prosecuted. And it's no coincidence that Abhay Tipse is a member of the Congress party. Even Markande Katchu, who kind of sermonizes a lot on Twitter, was another of the expert witnesses who testified on his behalf. So he's pretty much tried everything, and I think at this stage he's definitely going to come back. He's going to get extradited. thanks to the UK courts, and also there must have been some sort of influence of Preeti Patel, who's the Home Secretary. So they're definitely going to get him extradited. Malya's case is similar. The only other reason that Malya is not yet extradited is there's apparently a prosecution course case against him where he's being prosecuted in UK. So unless that gets dealt with, he's not going to get extradited to India. I think. I mean, it's a good thing that it's finally happening, and the government has also done its bit. In 2018, they came up with the Fugitive Economic Offenders Act, which allows them to basically confiscate assets of economic offenders like Nirav Modi and Vijay Mallya, who run a scam or don't repay their loans and then flee off to foreign countries. So the government is doing its bit to tighten the loophole. Uh, and yeah, I think he may appeal again, but I don't think the result is going to be significantly different. We should see him in an Indian jail soon.
Yeah, there's a pretty entertaining documentary called Bad Boy Billionaires on Netflix that covers the Nirav Modi scam. It's pretty interesting actually. All right, moving on. Syska LED has won a market tender to supply 10 million LED bulbs in rural areas. Under the recently launched Gram Ujjwala scheme, Syska will offer the world's cheapest bulbs at 10 rupees each. The revenue earned from carbon credits will contribute 60 rupees per LED bulb. Under the United Nations Clean Development Mechanism, the scheme will claim carbon credits. Also, under the new scheme, the rural consumers' incandescent and CFL bulbs will be taken back. According to the Energy Efficiency Services Limited, India is currently the second largest LED market in the world by value. The Ujjwala scheme is likely to help avoid peak electricity demand of 9,428 megawatts. Ashish, what do you think about this?
Yeah, very interesting intervention in the power side. I mean, see, government has been doing this since the last 6-7 years, which is that it has been acting as an aggregator to force economies of scale in a relatively short period of time. Now, if the government started promoting the sales of, say, LED bulbs, we may not have reached a stage where the prices would have crashed from 1,000 rupees to 100 rupees by themselves, right? But because the government said that, okay, we will make it easier to distribute, etc., and the EESL, which is the public sector entity, Energy Efficiency Services Limited, they took up multiple projects to procure centrally and then distribute. That kind of crashed the prices, right? And of course, some India local manufacturing has also started. The Syska win, which is a Gram Ujala, not Ujjwala scheme, Gram Ujala scheme, which will also lead to taking the benefits of LED bulbs to the villages. So now, given that they are doing 1 crore bulbs, one of the asks, of course, is to manufacture this in India. The components of LED bulbs and the finished product themselves is a big import item from China for us. So this tender not just helps in making the energy consumption more efficient at the village level, it also actually spurts the manufacturing of one of the import dependency items locally. That's part of the tender actually. So this will have to be done in India, most of the components. And the other aspect of this is, as you mentioned, Carrie, is that we will, since the consumption becomes more efficient, we start consuming less electricity. 9 gigawatts of savings annually in the steady state, which is that after all the 1 crore bulbs are operational. So overall, a very interesting model, which is that government becomes an aggregator. It allows private player to basically participate in a tender where it is underwriting the supply of a commodity or a good, and that then gets adopted by people at large. The same thing at some point, it has been tried for electric vehicles also. It did not work too well, but I think some of these ideas can be extended for goods which we want to be adopted very, very rapidly. So the government underwrites the tender, gives a guarantee of purchase to the private sector player, and then basically distributes it using a public-private partnership.
All right. Moving on, the India Meteorological Department has predicted normal rainfall across the country this year. According to the National Weather Forecaster, the probability of 2021 monsoon being normal was at 40% with a 21% chance of it being above average. The IMD has adopted a new system to predict the monsoon this year. It's known as the multimodal ensemble. This method improves the skill of forecasts and reduce forecast errors. The forecast of normal rainfall is good news for India's farm sector driving the rural economy. We are likely to see a good acreage of kharif crops and adequate water storage in major water bodies. Srivatsa, this is fantastic news.
It is. I think this is the first time since 98. So 96, 97, 98 was the first time was the last time, I should say, when we had 3 years of normal rainfall in a row. And this is the third year in a row that we are seeing normal rainfall. So it's definitely good news in that sense, whether it be agriculture and so on. I think one of the things that we should talk about is the investment that has been made in IMD in the last few years, and how the IMD has gotten better and more accurate when it comes to forecast. Right? You mentioned the mechanism that they use and so on, but they're also looking to add, for instance, 550 unmanned sort of stations through which they can monitor the weather. They're also looking to for ways to kind of capture soil moisture and so on, so that they can predict landslide better. The IMD, this has kind of gone under the radar. This whole development where their accuracy has gone up from around 45% to 70% now, and that from a forecasting standpoint is a pretty good accuracy. Uh, I mean, if you really understand these things and are not looking at Netflix etc. to understand how modeling etc. works, uh, then I would say that the performance is pretty good. Uh, in addition, the IMD is also tying up with the National Oceans Department, which is the National Institute of Oceans Technology, to understand kind of wind patterns and what's happening in the oceans, and using that to improve their forecast. Uh, Ultimately, to have better forecasts, you need more data, you need longer term data, and the IMD is kind of doing a pretty good job in increasing the infrastructure from where it's capturing the data, uh, and also tying up with other organizations, and having more accurate forecasts obviously helps planning, be it agriculture or other industries that are kind of dependent on rain. It can
Right.
also probably help city planning and so on, in terms of understanding how much rainwater will get collected, and then how do they kind of have to ration it and so on. So yeah, I mean, it's a good kind of progress that has happened since around 2012 with respect to the IMD.
All right, moving on. India's drug regulator is considering granting emergency usage approval for foreign vaccines. Amid a record spike in daily coronavirus infections, the Central Drug Standard Control Organization will take a decision on applications seeking approval for restricted emergency use of foreign produced vaccines. The central government on Tuesday decided to fast track emergency approvals for all COVID 19 vaccines that have been given a similar nod by the WHO or regulators in other countries. On Thursday, India registered its biggest ever single day spike with 200,739 fresh cases. Ashish, in the midst of the second wave, plenty of comments as well on YouTube and elsewhere, right? Anything else that you would like to add?
The only point here is that while we have approved vaccines approved by other countries to be used on an emergency use basis in India, the thing is, it is not going to make much of a difference because those vaccines don't have stocks. In fact, they are not able to even fulfill their existing orders because J&J has been banned in US. Well, not banned, but temporarily suspended in US, and Europe is not using AZ in some countries. They need replacements from Pfizer, and the challenge is Pfizer is now promising the emergency supply to Europe by June. So Indian approval doesn't mean much, in the sense that even if they come to India, they will have a very small quantity. The problem, Carrie, is that a lot of people who have been backing this move, I mean, it's okay to argue that anyone vaccinated is a good thing, but the challenge here is that this will only vaccinate at the most a few lakh, maybe a crore, couple of crore people, right? So that is not a national health solution. It can be the solution for the person who talks the loudest on social media or in the media, but it is not a national health solution in any way. So while too much time has been disproportionately spent on this topic, it's not going to help India's fight against COVID. It will help people who have a voice to talk about it in media, etc.
All right, so that brings us to an end for this week's weekly. As usual, we had plenty of love and support. People continue to call us underrated and whatnot, right? Hopefully not for too long, as I've said before. And pretty interesting comments on the Manohar Parrikar episode as well. Yogesh Singh saying that he would have been a fantastic PM, right? So as earlier, I mean, time to remind you guys that we have a premium subscription on YouTube. So there is the Plus and the Prime plan that gives you access to various other new content and other AMA sort of things. In fact, we're considering a policy AMA coming up shortly, right? We discuss plenty of policies and schemes on Bharatvaarta. We do deep dives on industries and sectors. And oftentimes there are very fundamental questions in terms of how the policy is structured, who the priorities, how these priorities are, various priorities are met, and so on and so forth, right? So Ashish and Vatsa will add a little more depth on all those fronts. Ashish, quick comments on that before we wind up.
Yeah, so we will do it in the format of like a presentation / Q&A, presentation plus Q&A rather. The idea is to deep dive into how politicians think about creating policy. I think there's a lot of confusion about that aspect. People have very theoretical views of how policies are formulated. The real world constraints are very different, and we will try and uncover some of that.
Yeah. All right. Sounds super interesting. Thank you again for joining us for this edition of the Bharatvaarta Weekly. A couple of very good episodes coming up this week, and hope to see you all soon. So until next time, from Ashish, Vatsa and myself, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.